Have you ever noticed that you stay calm when things fall apart, but feel strangely out of place in today's world? That you don't panic in chaos, yet constant noise, notifications, and speed feel exhausting? If you grew up in the 1970s, this isn't random, and it's not nostalgia. It's a psychological imprint your brain received during a childhood environment that no longer exists. Most people assume that growing up back then just made you tougher or old school. But psychology tells a deeper story because the way you think, tolerate silence, assess risk, and handle pressure today was shaped long before smartphones, algorithms, and constant supervision rewired modern brains. And once you see what that era actually did to your nervous system, you'll understand why you feel different and why that difference still matters. Trait number 1: self-directed problem solving. The first rare trait psychologists consistently notice in people from this era is self-directed problem solving. And it usually started with one sentence every 70 seconds kid remembers: go find something to do, or I'll find something for you to do. You knew exactly what that meant. If you complained about boredom, suddenly you were folding laundry, sweeping floors, or pulling weeds. So you adapted fast. Research on unstructured childhood shows that when children are forced to create their own entertainment, their executive function and creativity develop more strongly. You weren't scheduled, you weren't guided. You had to invent your day from nothing. That's why you spent hours on bikes, disappeared into books, or built entire worlds out of sticks, dirt, and imagination. Without realizing it, your brain learned something modern childhood often skips entirely: how to generate purpose without being told what to do. And that ability didn't disappear. It became the foundation of how you handle life. But creativity is only part of the story, because if you've ever noticed that you stay unusually calm when things go wrong, when others panic, freeze, or spiral, that didn't happen by accident. Trait number 2: adaptive risk calibration. People who grew up in the 1970s learned something psychologists call adaptive risk calibration. In simple terms, you learned how to tell the difference between real danger and manageable risk. And you didn't learn it from warning labels or safety lectures. You learned it by living it. You climbed trees that were too high, rode bikes without helmets, played near roads, explored abandoned places, lit firecrackers, pushed limits just enough to feel alive. Every scraped knee, every close call, every minor disaster quietly trained your nervous system. Developmental psychology shows that children who experience physical risk through play develop better threat assessment and lower baseline anxiety as adults. Your brain learned, this feels scary, but I'm not actually in danger. That's why even today, when situations get intense, work pressure, family chaos, unexpected problems, you don't collapse. You assess, you adapt, you act. Not because you're fearless, but because your fear system was trained properly. And that brings us to something most younger generations struggle to understand. Trait number 3: comfortable solitude. People who grew up in the 70s often carry what psychologists call comfortable solitude capacity. You spent long stretches of time alone, listening to music, lying on the grass, walking, thinking. Not because you were lonely, Manu, but because nothing was constantly demanding your attention. No notifications, no endless feeds, no algorithm pulling your focus every 3 seconds. Studies on pre-digital childhood show that people who grew up before constant connectivity experience significantly less anxiety when alone with their thoughts. In fact, modern research found that many adults today would rather receive mild electric shocks than sit quietly with themselves for 15 minutes. If you grew up in the 70s, that probably sounds ridiculous. You learned early that boredom isn't an emergency. Silence isn't dangerous. Being alone doesn't mean something is wrong, and that inner stability still shows today. But it didn't stop there. Trait number 4: analog patience. The fourth rare trait is what psychologists often describe as analog patience. You were trained to wait constantly. You waited a full week to watch your favorite TV show. You took photos and waited days to see if they even turned out. You memorized phone numbers and hoped the person was home. Research on delayed gratification consistently shows that people who grow up waiting for things develop stronger impulse control, healthier relationships, and greater long-term success. Your childhood was one long lesson in patience. That's why instant gratification doesn't fully satisfy you today. Endless scrolling feels empty. Quick dopamine hits feel shallow. Your nervous system is wired for depth, not speed. Trait number 5: unsupervised autonomy. And now we reach the trait that ties everything together. You grew up with unsupervised autonomy wiring. At 8 or 9 years old, you left the house with one rule: be back before the streetlights turn on. No tracking apps, no check-in texts, no constant supervision. You rode your bike miles away, played in woods, crossed neighborhoods alone, made decisions, and dealt with the consequences yourself. Research on childhood independence shows that children given freedom of movement without constant monitoring develop stronger internal motivation. motivation, better judgment, and higher self-trust as adults. Your parents weren't your friends. They were authority figures, and they trusted you to be capable. That trust rewired your brain. So if you ever look at today's world and feel out of place, remember this: you're not outdated. You're carrying psychological strengths that are slowly disappearing. The independence that looks like emotional distance, that's competence. The comfort with silence that looks antisocial, that's depth. The ability to wait that looks like apathy, that's discipline. You survived a childhood that would get parents arrested today, and it didn't damage you. It built you. For a brief moment in history, childhood was both free and formative, civilized and feral at the same time. If you grew up in the 1970s, you didn't just live through a decade, you lived through a psychological blueprint the modern world no longer knows how to create. If you grew up in the 70s, comment below. And if this explained things you felt your entire life, subscribe. Because this channel decodes the psychology behind who you really are,